Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our commemoration of the passing of Terry Schiavo 12 years ago. I'd like now to introduce our guest speaker. He is a graduate of Catholic Memorial High School and St. Michael's College. At Florida State University, he earned a master's degree in social work and a Juris Doctor. He has been practicing law and has been an active member in good standing of the Massachusetts Bar since 1976. He served as an officer and director with the Massachusetts Citizens for Life. He said in an interview that in 1986, he represented a couple in California whose full-term child had been stillborn as a result of questionable medical practice. They had been advised by a reputable California attorney that under state law, a wrongful death action would not be permitted under those circumstances. Communication and interaction did not occur between a mother and her child under 13, during which they have established a website and Facebook page. So without further ado, I will introduce Attorney Joyce.
Well, thank you very much, Bridget, and thank you, brothers and sisters, for inviting me out here today. It really is a privilege and a joy for me to be here. I was hoping that I might talk during a class, so that if I talk during a class, you could maybe miss a homework assignment or not have to take a test or something like that. But I guess you're going to miss any classes, so we'll go forward anyway. Today we're going to review the Terry Schiavo case and what it means in Massachusetts. And it's a complex issue involving the judiciary and the legislature. And but before I talk about that, I want to talk about the power that you have. Now, you obviously don't have the power to write legislation, and you don't have the power yet to make judicial decisions. I hope that with the formation that you're receiving here and with the individual study that you do, one day you will be making legislation and you will be pronouncing judicial decisions. But I want to talk to you for a moment about what power you do have right here in your communities, and that's the power to affect public sentiment. Now, Abraham Lincoln had something to say about public sentiment. He said that in this age, in this country, public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Whoever molds public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or pronounces judicial decisions. Think about that. Public sentiment is more powerful than legislation and more powerful than judicial decisions. And you, each and every day, have a unique opportunity to mold public sentiment. And how do you do it? Well, you do it by just educating yourself about the issues that are important, which you're doing now, and then having the courage to step up and to talk about it, to evangelize about it. Now, some young people, I think, well, who's going to listen to me? I'm so young, or this sort of thing. But I want to tell you that adults, and especially older adults like myself, just love to see young people who are prepared, who have done their homework, who present their thoughts clearly and in a polite way, and that has a tremendous impact on us. So I'm going to encourage you to read, to study, to pray, never to doubt yourself, and then to step forward and be heard. You know, there was a Monsignor. He's now passed. His name was John Dillon Day, Monsignor John Dillon Day, and I remember him talking to a group at the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund at one of our dinners. And I remember him saying to us, he said, there are certain things that you have to remember. 3 things you have to remember, he said. Every one of you is a disciple. 2, you should never doubt the effectiveness of what you are going to say in evangelizing your cause. And 3, and very importantly, if you don't do it, it won't get done. So I'm passing Monsignor Dillon Day's advice along to you, and I'm sure he's happy about that. I know that you've studied the case of Terry Schiavo, so I don't want to go over it in too much detail, but I do think it would be instructive or helpful maybe to review the timeline, and this is what I saw from the website, from the Chavo website. So I'm just going to march through that very quickly. 1990, Terry's 26 years old. Her heart stops. She has a brain injury because of lack of oxygen. She receives physical therapy, and it's helping. She starts to say words like no and stop and mommy and this kind of thing, and then the therapy is stopped. I couldn't believe it. Why? Why stop if she's making progress? There's a medical malpractice lawsuit in 1992, an award of $1.5 million for Terry and $600,000 to her husband Michael, and $780,000 of that is in a trust fund for her future help and therapy needs, and still no therapy. Very shocking. And then in 1993, there's a conflict between Terry's parents and her husband Michael about the lack of therapy. They want to see her have therapy. And the parents challenge him in court when he refuses to authorize antibiotics for her when she has a urinary tract infection, which is against the law. And they have to go to court, and he's ordered to do that. And then he becomes engaged and refuses to divorce Terry, and they have 2 children. And then he petitions to withdraw her life support, and a guardian ad litem is appointed. Guardian ad litem is a person who doesn't represent either of the parties in the case, but is assigned by the court to take an independent look at it and advise the judge. So the guardian ad litem issues a report that says, don't take away the feeding tube. But nevertheless, the judge rules, no, we're going to withdraw that. The guardian ad litem, by the way, pointed out some serious conflicts there. The husband there had a financial interest in this, $800,000. He had not disclosed the opinion of other people with respect to Terry. But anyway, so it went back and forth from court, as you know, appeals court, Supreme Court, and the tube was taken out and then put back in, taken out, put back in. And then when they didn't make enough progress, when the Chavo parents didn't make enough progress in the courts, the Florida legislature passed a special law enabling Governor Bush to order that the feeding tube be reinserted and to have a guardian ad litem appointed. And then that law was ruled unconstitutional, and it was upheld by the Florida Appeals Court, and it was upheld by the Florida Supreme Court, and the United States Court didn't take it. And lo and behold, Terry eventually had the tube removed, and after, I think it was 14 days or so, she died of dehydration. Well, that was certainly a tragedy, and you wonder, well, is there any silver lining in it? And I think that the silver lining is that the Chavo family and Bobby Chavo started a group called the Terry Chavo Life and Hope Network, which serves medically vulnerable persons at risk of being marginalized rather than supported and loved, and that it has served thus far over 1,000 families and been involved in in hundreds of cases and given speeches in 44 states and 9 countries. So that's good, because it's keeping her life and her purpose alive for us. Well, what does all this mean for Massachusetts? Well, I think that the way I want to approach this is to mention that here in Massachusetts, we stand on the shoulders of giants who have given us great guidance about how we should proceed in defense of the sanctity of life. I'm going to refer to 2. One, St. John Paul II, the statements that he made when he was Pope, and second, some statements that 3 justices of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which is the highest state court here in Massachusetts, had to say about a case somewhat similar to Terry's case. Let's take a look at what Pope John Paul said, and this was about a year before Terry's tube was withdrawn. And he said that we have to remember that not a few of these persons with appropriate treatment and with specific rehabilitation programs have been able to emerge from that condition. The condition is called the vegetative state, and he said we really shouldn't use that term because it really argues against the humanity of the person. He said that I feel a duty to reaffirm strongly that the intrinsic value and personal dignity of every human being do not change, no matter what the concrete circumstances of his or her life. A man, even in a seriously ill or disabled state, in the exercise of his highest functions, is and always will be a man, and he will never become a vegetable or an animal. Even our brothers and sisters who find themselves in the clinical condition of a vegetative state retain their human dignity in all its fullness. The loving gaze of God the Father continues to fall upon them, acknowledging them as his sons and daughters, especially in need of help. Now that's a beautiful statement, and I had an occasion to be guided by that type of thought one time years ago when, as a lawyer, I was asked to represent a man who had been admitted to the Massachusetts General Hospital, and I got a call from his loving nephew. He was a single man, his loving nephew, and he said that his aunt, the brother of the patient, had been appointed guardian, and he felt that the Massachusetts General Hospital was putting pressure on them to decide for a do not resuscitate order and to suspend life-supporting treatment. And he asked if I could help. And everything that we do in the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund is pro bono. We don't get paid for it. We do it because we love to do it, and we do it because, in my case and many others, because it's God's work and/or it's just very important work in order to defend human rights and human dignity. So I went in, and lo and behold, I was told that I couldn't take part in the group meeting, and we got past that obstacle, and I had a chance to review the record, and I saw that he was on anti-seizure medication and that he was having some help with a ventilator. And in the group of medical personnel there, I said, what if we were to reduce the rate of the ventilation and see how he tolerates it? Would that help give him a better chance to show more cognition? And they said, no, that wouldn't. And I asked why, and they said, well, because the risk of seizure would be too high. Well, I'm not a doctor, and I figured that sounds pretty good to me, you know. I said, now, what about the anti-seizure medication? I know that affects cognition. What if you were to gradually lower the dose of the anti-seizure medication and see how he tolerates that? Nope, you can't do that either. Why not? Well, because the risk of seizure would be too great. Okay. So I went back for probably 6 or 7 weeks on a weekly basis, and I noticed that the amount of anti-seizure medication was being reduced, and that the ventilation was being reduced, and he was doing well, and I was delighted. And I thought, well, okay, you're not telling me that it's okay, but you're doing it, and he's improving, so that's terrific. Well, then they have a change of medical team in there, and we go to a meeting, and the new head of the care is reporting on, I'll call him Mr. D, and he talks about Mr. D is not functioning, and he's very sick, and when he finishes, now we have about 15 or 18 medical people in the room, and I said, I'd like to ask a question. I said, I didn't have the privilege of knowing Mr. D while he was alive, but I know about him through his sister and his nephew, and I know that he was a very religious man. I know that when he was mobile, he would go to church daily, and he was a daily communicant. And I know that he believed that there was communication between him and his Lord, and that communication took place through Scripture, God talking to him, and through his prayer, him talking to God. And I said, and that sounds like a pretty reasonable approach to life. I said, it happens to be the one that I have. I said, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask everybody in the room now, I'd like to ask a question, and I'd like a simple yes or no answer. So I said, we've been talking about Mr. D not having function. I said, is prayer a human function? And there was a silence in the room. And the silence lasted for 10 seconds, and that's a long time when there's 15 medical people there. And I said, and then a young nurse who was over in the corner said, "Yes, I think it is." And then there was another long silence, and I said, "Well, there being no one refuting that, I'm going to assume that there's no one here who's prepared to take the position that prayer is not a human function." Now, second question, is there anybody here who is prepared to say that Mr. D is incapable of prayer? And again, the longest silence. And no one said anything. And I said, well, I'm going to interpret that silence, that there's nobody here who's prepared to say that Mr. D is incapable of prayer. Now, if Mr. D is right, and if there is a God, and if he wants communication with we human beings, let's wonder whether or not that Lord might be looking down on everything that's happening here in the hospital now, and he might be more satisfied with what he's getting from Mr. D than he is from all of us who are trying to find ways to end Mr. D's life. So that was very good, and we made some real progress. A little bit later on, Mr. D, his kidneys were failing, and the doctor said, well, we're not going to give him dialysis. And I had established a very good relationship with the lawyer for the Mass General Hospital, and I asked her, I said, could I talk with the new doctor? And she said, Bob, I can't think of any other lawyer that I'd let do that, but I know you won't abuse it. So yes, so I talked with him, and he explained to me, he said, you don't understand. He said, dialysis is not going to cure this man. And I said, doctor, isn't it true that dialysis doesn't cure anybody? It just maintains them and it helps them. It cleans out their system. And when you say you're not going to give him dialysis, aren't you really making a statement about the quality of his life? And who are you to do that? Well, he didn't have a good answer for that. But we did go to court, and we got a temporary restraining order requiring the hospital to give that treatment. And I'm happy to say that Mr. D was transferred out of that hospital into a place where he did get dialysis and lived for about another 7 months, came out of the semi-conscious state that he was in, watched the Channel Word network on the television, and enjoyed time with his wife and with his sister and his nephew. I guess what I want to say on this is that sometimes there are situations that come up that you don't even know whether you're really ready for them, you know. I certainly didn't feel 100% ready. I don't know where those questions came from. They just came to me, you know. But it's important that you step up and you do something about that. Teddy Roosevelt has a quote that he said, in a moment of decision, the best thing to do is the right thing. The worst thing to do is nothing. Do what you can with what you have where you are. And I'm going to encourage all of you, if there's ever a time that you say, gee, I don't know what I should do, I don't know, maybe I should just keep quiet. Well, if you know what you're talking about, have the courage to stand up and to be heard, presenting yourself always in a polite and dignified way. Back to John Paul, St. John Paul II. I recall what I wrote in the encyclical Evangelium Vitae. Euthanasia is always a serious violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. By psychological, social, and economic pressures, cannot take precedence over the general principles. Well, thank you, Pope John Paul II. That's good instruction, good for us. I think it's a nice segue into a case that I want to talk with you about today. It's a Massachusetts case decided in 1986. The law is still effective. It hasn't been overruled. It's the case of Brophy versus the New England Sinai Hospital. And this is a case where there was a firefighter, Paul Brophy Sr., and he was a robust, energetic, active guy who one night had a splitting headache, and it was an aneurysm, and he had to be taken to the hospital, and he had brain damage, and he eventually, there was surgery that was unsuccessful. A gastrostomy tube was inserted with his wife's consent. A gastroscopy tube goes into the stomach, as you probably know, and food is fed through the tube. He was, in terms of a medical condition, he was not brain dead. He was unconscious. He was comfortable. He was not terminally ill, and he was not in danger of imminent death. And the liquid food that was given to him was not given by mechanical means. It was just gravity coming from a bag that was above and just went through plastic tubing right into his stomach. But his wife petitioned the court to remove the tube. And the judge, the probate court judge here in Norfolk County, took evidence on it, and he appointed a guardian ad litem, again, to advise the court. And the guardian ad litem reported that the tube should not be removed, but that a DNR order would be appropriate, and that if he became with a very bad infection, there wouldn't be a requirement for very aggressive treatment of that infection. That was what the guardian ad litem said. And the judge went along and said, okay, you're not going to remove the tube. The matter was appealed, and the highest court in the land, highest court in the state, the Supreme Judicial Court, took it from the appellate court because they took it on, direct review, and they made some very, very interesting statements. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of their statements, and then I'm going to read to you what these three justices, who were the dissenters in a 4-3 decision. The majority had 4 justices who voted to authorize the removal of the tube. And there were 3 dissenters were Justice Nolan, who was a great friend of the St. Benedict Center, Justice Lynch, and Justice O'Connor, who was just a wonderful guy. And I'm going to say, I think it would be helpful if I say what the court said, and then what they responded. I'll be doing some reading here because the words speak much better than I do. Excuse me. The judge started the decision off by saying, "We are asked to decide whether the substituted judgment of a person, in this case through the wife, in a permanent vegetative state, that the artificial maintenance of his nutrition and hydration be discontinued, shall be honored." That's the way he framed the case. Now, they pointed out that the trial judge had inferred that this is what the patient would have wanted. The patient had never said that that's what he would wanted, but the judge inferred that from other statements that he was presented to by the patient. This is what Judge Nolan had to say about that. "I pass over the glaring weakness in the evidentiary basis for the finding that Paul Brophy would decline provisions for food and water. The evidence that he knew the horrors of such a death is not present in this case. And without such evidence, it can be argued persuasively that Brophy never made a judgment that food and water should be denied him." And this is what Justice Lynch had to say about that. Justice Lynch said, "The withdrawal of the provision of food and water is particularly difficult, painful, and a gruesome death. Removal of the G-tube would likely create various effects from the lack of hydration and nutrition, leading ultimately to death. Brophy's mouth would dry out and become caked or coated with thick material. His lips would become parched and cracked. His tongue would swell and might crack. His eyes would recede back into their orbits, and his cheeks would become hollow. The lining of his nose might crack and cause his nose to bleed. His skin would hang loose on his body and become dry and scaly. His urine would become highly concentrated, leading to burning of the bladder. The lining of his stomach would dry out, and he would experience dry heaves and vomiting. His body temperature would become very high. His brain cells would dry out, causing convulsions. His respiratory tract would dry out, and the thick secretions that would result could plug his lungs and cause death. At some point, within 5 days to 3 weeks, his major organs, including his lungs, heart, and brain, would give out, and he would die. The judge found that death by dehydration is extremely painful and uncomfortable for a human being. The judge could not rule out the possibility that Paul Brophy could experience pain in such a scenario. Paul Brophy's attending physician described death by dehydration as cruel and violent. With that in mind, Justice O'Connor had something to say. And Justice O'Connor said, "The court's statement of the trial judge's findings concerning the choice Brophy would have made, were he competent, to decline the provisions of food and water and to terminate his life is critically incomplete." And Judge Lynch had something else to say, very significant. Judge Lynch said, "Here, where Paul Brophy did not specifically advert to the choice which the majority now make for him, we should not be so quick to overlook the state's interest in protecting human life and the law against suicide." So suicide comes into the picture here, or does it? So what does this court have to say about that? The majority says, nor do we consider his death to be against the state's interest in the prevention of suicide. Well, you wonder, well, can they really say that? Well, let's look at what Justice Lynch said about that. Justice Lynch said, "My principal objection is that the state's interest in the preservation of life has not been given appropriate weight. In addition, unlike the Sakowitz case, the majority nullified, if only in part, the law against suicide. The interest in the preservation of life consists of at least two related concerns. First, the state has an interest in preserving the life of the particular patient. Second, the state has a closely related interest in preserving the sanctity of all human life." We don't have anyone on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court now who could even come close to making a statement like that. And that's very sad, because it's evidence that in the legal community, the culture of death is winning, or at least has secured many of the positions that were previously held by advocates for the sanctity of life. Justice Lynch also said, "Massachusetts law has not heretofore acknowledged a right to die emanating from the right to privacy, but now, in essence, it does." You've heard about the slippery slope, and you've heard about how things can progress one to the other. Well, let's just do this. It's harmless, but it progresses. And I'm sure that many of you are aware of what's going on in the state of Massachusetts with respect, and the whole nation, but with respect to doctor-assisted suicide. It's a very, very significant issue. You know that a few years ago there was a petition to allow we call it physician-prescribed suicide. They call it, I think, death with dignity, or some euphemism. And our interest prevailed, but only by 51% to 49%, so it was close. And the proponents of physician-assisted suicide came right back with another bill, And that was presented, it was dealt with by the legislature in 2015. And we, the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund, was heard on that. And we made the point in legislative testimony that you have to understand that we're dealing here with human rights, and that one of the human rights, that it is a human right to be free from abuse, and that elderly are particularly subject to abuse. Here in Massachusetts, the official statistics showed that from 2009 to 2013, reports of elderly abuse had gone up 33%, and that in 2013 there were 21,300 reports of elderly abuse. And researchers had drawn conclusions that for every reported case of elderly abuse, there were anywhere between 5 and 23 cases of unreported instances of elderly abuse. So it's a real problem. And you say, well, where does a person, an elder, how does a person deal with that? Well, let's take a look particularly of an elderly person whose family members have passed away, whose friends have passed away, who doesn't have a lot of resources, doesn't have maybe any money, and he or she finds himself in a situation where they're being pressured to make decisions that they don't want to make. But where do they turn? They can't. There's only so many pro bono lawyers out there, you know, and there's only so many social workers, and many of the social workers don't share the position that we share. So that's a real problem. And we pointed out that the signing of the request and the administration of the drug could all take place in one day under this bill at a major hospital. And we found that there was no supervision of the administration of the drug. So if there was abuse at the administration of the drug, who would know about it? So there were all kinds of pitfalls in that. And fortunately, the bill didn't go forward. But it's coming back, and it's going to keep coming back. And we've got to ready ourselves to be heard effectively in opposition. And remember I talked about public sentiment? This is something that every one of you can understand. And I'm going to suggest something. You say, well, how do I bring this up? Well, how about something just as simple as this? I'm a student at Immaculate Heart of Mary High School, and I believe that it's very important for us to find the truth in order to establish justice in our community. I've tried very hard to research and to study the issues of medical science and law around this matter of physician-assisted suicide, and I'd like to talk with you, but if it makes you feel uncomfortable, just tell me and I'll stop. But I wonder, can we talk? And it's a perfect opening for you. And we kind of chip away one by one. We make our point. I got to keep an eye on the clock. I'm doing okay. Maybe I'm not doing okay. We only got about 10 minutes left, huh? 10 minutes left. I want to leave some time when I finish for you to hear from Brittany Nichols, who's here, who has been gracious enough to come out here with me today. Brittany is a second-year law student at the Suffolk University Law School, and she's from Virginia and a graduate of Liberty University. And she came up to our table of the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund last year when we had a table at the Suffolk University and Boston Bar Association's Pro Bono Fair. And she saw some of the work that we have done, and she's graciously volunteered to come out and help for over a year now, and she's been an enormous help. So you're going to hear from Brittany in a few minutes. Brittany, give me the high sign to stop whenever I should, okay? Oh, good. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that there's more to the Brophy decision, but I can't go through it now. We just don't have enough time. But I think you get an idea of a witness to the courage of people who share our pro-life philosophy in black robes, to be willing to stand up to the culture of death and to make beautiful points. Now, our duty is not to let these points die on the vine. We take them from them. We say, thank you for stating that. Thank you for writing that. Let us absorb it, and then let us pass it on, so that this state changes back once again to a culture of life. You know, when I was getting ready to practice law. My father was a great man. He used to unload fruit from the docks down in Boston for United Fruit, and he was very dexterous, and they used to call him in to do the payroll on Thursdays. And one day a guy came in and he said, "Pat," he says, you operate that machine pretty well. You ought to come to work for my company." And Dad said, "Well, what's your company?" He says, "Well, it's International Business Machines, known as IBM." And Dad said, "Well, what is it all about?" So he told him. And so Dad went home. Dad and Ma had 4 children at the time, and he would be a salesman. He'd never done any sales before. And the family lore is that Dad said to Ma, "You know, I don't know, what should I do? I mean, I wouldn't make as much money." And Ma said, "Well, we got by on less money before, and if you want to do it, you should go and do it." And he did. And he had a wonderful career as a salesman and as a sales manager before some health concerns slowed him down in his late 1950s. But he advised me 2 very simple rules when I started practicing law. He said, "Just remember this: act, don't react." He said, "You're going to be in situations where people's emotions are very high about money or family matters or business or whatever, but don't ever let yourself react. Just decide what is the right thing to do and then do it." And the second thing is, whatever is in front of you, do it well. Because he said there are few enough people in the world who simply do everything that is in front of them well. If you do it, you will be noticed, you will be appreciated, and you will succeed. That was very good advice. It's worked for me, so I'm passing it along to you. Act, don't react, especially in this volatile pro-life, pro-choice area. It's easy for things to get out of hand, so act and don't react. And I'm going to close before introducing Brittany with the sage advice of the patriarch of the pro-life movement here in Massachusetts, Dr. Joseph Stanton. He said, "Protection of innocent human life in its most fragile and awesome beginning, across the long day and at its so often dependent close, is at once the highest privilege and the most profound obligation of a caring and humane society." So I'm happy to pass that advice along to you, and I'm very happy to have been here, and I'm very happy to introduce Brittany Nichols from Suffolk University Law School. Thank you very much.
Takes a little longer in heels. I know you guys are out in a minute or two, so I'm going to make it quick. But like Bob said, I'm a second-year law student at Suffolk. I'm from Southern Virginia, so here in the Northeast with all your wonderful snow. But basically, like Bob said, I've been involved with PLLDF, which is the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund that we work with, and that focuses on the importance of life at the very beginning, so abortion issues, and like Bob talked about, physician-assisted suicide, so issues of life at the very end. We get to work on a whole bunch of different cases. Since I've been here, we've done everything from writing amicus curiae briefs, which are briefs that go to the Supreme Court to recommend to them how to handle a case. We've done everything from represent individuals to helping organizations all over Massachusetts, and it's been a fantastic experience. Bob was actually my very first legal experience when I moved up here and went to law school. And before that, I actually was a peer counselor in Virginia. So they have them up here, but they have what they call pregnancy resource centers. And there was one down by me. It was the only one for about 60 miles because it's the middle of Bumble, Virginia. But so what they did was they trained us. They had about 40 hours of training, and we got to counsel these women and children. A lot of the girls were about 13 or 14 when they came in pregnant. And these were girls that found themselves in crisis pregnancy situations where they were either being pressured to abort or they didn't know what they were going to do when they had that baby. And so we provided them with free ultrasounds and counseling, and it was a Christian organization, so we got the opportunity to share the gospel with them. And a lot of these girls were just kind of lost. Like, it's a very scary position to be in. And there was just one in particular that stuck with me, and it was crazy because we were born exactly 2 days apart. So you know, you see someone who's maybe your life could have been exactly the same, and then at one point in time you just split off and you diverged into different paths. It was kind of a very trippy experience, I guess. It's kind of a weird way to describe it. But I saw this young woman who was 22 at the time, the same age as me back then, and she'd had 6 abortions. And she was a firecracker. She just stood up for herself and didn't take anybody's guff, and I knew the minute I walked into that other room, I'm like, she's gonna hate me. Oh my gosh, she's not gonna want to talk to me. Could not be any more different. And at the end of that, I was like, oh man, I really blew that. Oh well guys, sorry, I tried. But she came back, and she continued to come back every week for Bible study for the next 9 months. She ended up carrying that baby to term, and she was a beautiful little girl. And it was crazy because after she delivered that baby, she realized the doctors told her you can't have any more. All those abortions affected your ability to have children. So this is your last one. So it's kind of a really awesome God thing. You know, she didn't know that until after she had the baby, and that little girl is 3 years old. I think she starts preschool in the fall. But, you know, and I started doing that when I was 21, 22, so there are ways you guys can get involved. There's fantastic organizations like the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund that Bob and I work with, and a lot of other students, so it's never too young to start. You know, it's always important to get involved because all it takes for evil things to happen are for good people to do nothing. And in a lot of time, I just sat back in high school and I really didn't know. I mean, I was a kid. I was like, oh, I'm not really worried about that stuff. But then you get exposed to it and you get to see, you know, my best friend became pregnant when she was 16. So you get exposed to those things and it's scary as heck, but finding something you're passionate about, it's an amazing way to get involved. And I really encourage you guys, if you ever want to get involved with something along the lines of the Pro-Life Legal Defense Fund, please let Bob or I know. You know? So thanks for listening to us, and I think that's about it.
Brother, I don't know if you wanted to say a word or two, but I'm going to say a few words and then we'll say the closing prayer. And if you want to say something, let me know. But I do want to thank you so much, Mr. Joyce and Brittany, for coming today. It was a wonderful privilege to hear you speak today on this very important issue, the sanctity of life. You were very eloquent in everything you had to say. We're very grateful. And you came to commemorate Terry Schiavo, which we do every year, so this was truly a wonderful assembly. And I think there are great messages for all of us here. We have to be educated, we have to know about the sanctity of life, which we here at school, we are fully educated, and then we have to be prepared to speak out on these issues, as you put it, public sentiment, and we can make a difference. We have to share this, we have to be vocal. It may even just be our attitude, our actions, and above all, based on prayer. But thank you for these very encouraging words. And you've given us examples of some people who have made this a part of their public life. For example, these judges. So I hope that the students here at IHM, no matter what walk of life that they'll go into, they will also be proponents of the sanctity of life. I know there's at least one student here who is interested in being a lawyer. I think that's Nancy Bohane. I hope she doesn't mind that I mentioned that. But we all are striving for this in our private life, in our public life, to spread this pro-life message. And it may be, as Brittany said, it could be doing sidewalk counseling or whatever Our Lady and our Blessed Lord want us to do. So thank you again so very, very much for coming. We are very grateful to you, and we hope that you will come again. So we'll say a closing prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. An eternal rest prayer for Terry. Eternal rest grant unto her, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon her. And may she and all the souls the faithful departed, in the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.